Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
It's so frustrating to live in a culture that so often seems to define itself by its enemies. It's not as much who am I, what are my values, what do I think, what do I stand for. It's who are they? Why are they evil? Why must they be destroyed? It's everywhere. A culture of cruel people who want to be a hero, and so everywhere they look, they point and they say, there's the villain. And if we want to see examples of this, we have to look no further than the Christian Bible. God, for some reason, creates his own arch nemesis. What purpose could that possibly serve except to allow God to play good guy? I shall defeat the wicked. I shall crush the agent of absolute evil, the one who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. By the way, what is Satan killing and stealing and destroying? It's going to be us. And so God comes in and he saves the day. And there's a whole culture of people who are like this. And I am struck. I am just jaw-droppingly astounded at who they have decided the villains are. Everybody's a villain. Everybody's coming. Everybody is waging war. It's an assault on decency. It's an assault on their liberties. It's an assault on their religions. It's an assault on them as human beings. And so they rise up and they strap on their capes that are made out of, bath towels and shit like that. And they take the Sharpie and they draw the superhero symbol on their chest, and then they go out and make TikTok videos about how evil they are. How in the hell has Dr. Anthony Fauci become a villain in anybody's story? Now, this isn't, I've disagreed with him, or I have concerns about something that he has said. This isn't a nuanced perspective about a public servant. This is vilification. Strip away that man's medical license. Arrest him, put him in jail, hang Anthony Fauci. Holy shit. And these are supposed to be the righteous ones, the good guys in the story. I just look around and think, I cannot believe this is actually happening. And then I'm struck by how little most of us know about Fauci himself. We know him in a general sense. We know some basics about his life, but how much do we really know? Well, I'm not going to do a deep dive, but let's profile the man. Let's introduce each other to the man, because with knowledge comes perspective, and perspective is critical, I think, to living an honest life. Born in Brooklyn on Christmas Eve, 1940, Anthony Fauci was the son of a pharmacist. Anthony was an athlete and right away a history buff. His grandparents had immigrated to the United States from Italy in the late 19th century. He has a Catholic background, but even though in 2023 he still used the label Roman Catholic, he told the BBC that he doesn't really do or think anything Catholic. Here is an audio clip from his BBC interview last year.
You don't practice anymore, do you?
I don't. No.
Why?
A number of complicated reasons.
Go on. We have a whole corridor.
First of all, I think my own personal ethics on life are, I think, enough to keep me going on the right path. And I think that there are enough negative aspects about the organizational church that you're very well aware of. I'm not against it. I identify myself as a Catholic. I was raised, I was baptized, I was confirmed, I was married in the church. My children were baptized in the church. But as far as practicing it, it seems almost like a pro forma thing that I don't really need to do.
Anthony Fauci got his Doctor of Medicine from Cornell University. He joined the National Institutes of Health as a clinical associate in the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Laboratory of Clinical Investigation, or the NIAID. He was director of that organization by 1984, offered the job of director of the National Institutes of Health on many occasions, and on all of those occasions, he passed. When he was asked in an interview by The Guardian in 2020 to define his life, he said, "My career and my identity has really been defined by HIV." And I'll tell you what that means. Fauci was a lead researcher during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. By the way, there's a compelling book about the AIDS epidemic published in 1987. It's called And the Band Played On. It was written by a journalist named Randy Shilts. HBO made it into a movie starring Matthew Modine. That was 1993. And the book and the film expose the Reagan-era silence, the deafening silence about HIV. All of the religious moralizers, the Jerry Falwell types, they were out there preaching that this was the gay plague. It's a gay disease punishing gay people for their gayness. The PBS broadcast American Masters did a profile of the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and the backdrop for the response, here's a clip.
And we were one of the most hated communities in the country.
Say the word AIDS in public. That took the president 7 years.
Reagan, The polling showed that homophobia just kept rising during AIDS. There was a backlash. It was just getting worse and worse.
Now, that's absolutely accurate. Of course, Ronald Reagan was a practicing and public Christian, and there's no doubt he was not a fan of LGBT people, likely didn't consider gay people legitimate, certainly not gay marriage, perhaps even access to public health because God was punishing gays. I mean, who really knows what was going on in his mind? But I think it makes a lot of sense, especially seeing that Ronald Reagan didn't say a thing. He didn't reference AIDS once until 1985. Remember that AIDS was first recognized in 1981. His first public address about AIDS didn't happen until 1987. For most of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s, Ronald Reagan was stone silent. One of the challenges of that decade was chronicled by a historian, a woman named Jennifer Breyer. She wrote about how the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health, along with epidemiologists and public health advisors all across the country and around the world, they're all trying to get a handle on the AIDS epidemic. Many of Reagan's conservative advisors wanted to fit the response to what many considered to be God's judgment, the gay plague, in a Christian framework. And it was so often that they wouldn't even put HIV and the AIDS crisis on the Reagan agendas for him to speak about or know about or address. Not even the numbers, the statistics, people infected, the casualty and mortality rate. Nothing about any of that on the presidential agenda for the first half of the 1980s. Nothing. Dr. Fauci was there. He was an advisor to the Reagan administration. And at first he was really in the crosshairs of the LGBT community for the government's silence during a public health crisis. There was a guy named Larry Kramer, an AIDS activist and gay rights advocate. He roasted Fauci for being too inexperienced. He was not the right person for the job. He was just another agent in a do-nothing White House. In 1988, Larry Kramer called Fauci a murderer because, quote, your refusal to hear the screams of AIDS activists early in the crisis resulted in the deaths of thousands of queers. Now, Kramer would actually go on to live a pretty long life. He died at the age of 84, only recently, in fact. And during the time near the end of the HIV crisis and in the decades following, Larry Kramer and Dr. Anthony Fauci became friends, good friends. Here's Fauci reflecting on Larry Kramer. This is from the Logo YouTube page from 3 years ago.
So Larry was the most iconoclastic, theatrical, passionate group, and he introduced himself by writing an article with the headline, an open letter. No, I call you a murderer, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci. So in the realm of attention getting, he got my attention. Larry started Gay Men's Health Crisis with his colleagues, but he also started ACT UP in New York. And I got to get involved not only with Larry, but with activists, young men who really wanted to change the direction of where we were going and put much more resources and attention to this emerging plague.
What did your friendship with Larry teach you?
As I extended myself to listening to the activists, I found out that they were absolutely correct. And although they had to resort to theatrical disruptions to get the attention of the scientific community and the regulatory community and the federal government in general, I realized that I would have done exactly the same thing as they did. So I transformed from the object and the target of their activism to being an activist with them.
And it was Larry Kramer himself who would stand up to defend Dr. Anthony Fauci when he called for masks and distancing with COVID-19. His former critic was standing by his side to protect public health. During that Reagan era, Fauci was frustrated. He and his fellow scientists were desperately trying to break through until they finally persuaded Reagan to engage with some kind of government response. And it was during that response, it was during the solutions that came at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, with Fauci at the forefront, the opinion tide among much of the gay community started to shift. Let me go back and play another short clip from that PBS series. This was last year, as Fauci was sitting in a room with AIDS activists Greg Gonzalez, Peter Staley, and David Barr.
I developed long-term friendships with the activists. We were sort of like soldiers in the same war. I can't precisely remember when we actually first met.
We were all positive.
It was early 89.
We would have been how old?
I was 28. I was a baby.
We didn't get involved thinking, oh, we're going to get it and we're going to look at drug regulation and clinical research. We wanted treatment because we were sick. And the only place where there was any possible area to get any treatment was through the clinical research system. And that's what led us to you.
You were a target, a major target. He was the head of AIDS research.
You can actually see and hear the evolution of Dr. Fauci's understanding of what was going on in the gay community in the 1980s. At first, all the shouting and the protest and the noise, I think, overwhelmed him until he began to listen and engage and better understand and then align. In fact, it was Fauci who became a mediator between AIDS victims and the scientific community, and he worked feverishly to increase access to experimental treatments, pushing the government to amend its requirements to expand opportunities to try experimental remedies. Now, was Fauci's response perfect? Of course not. We all know that disease response is a moving target. He made a famous mistake back in 1983, suggesting AIDS might be spread by close contact, as in a family household. So if you were in an enclosed space, living with your loved ones, perhaps you could brush up against someone or have some other casual contact and possibly contract HIV. That wrong opinion was published, ultimately debunked, and Fauci had to reverse himself. But he wasn't an agent of lazy hysteria. He was a human being who was a scientist facing a massive problem, humanity's problem of HIV. Anthony Fauci was the primary person behind the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. This provided $90 billion in research and is estimated to have saved around 20 million lives through pandemic control in more than 50 countries all around the world. Today, as we all know, HIV is still with us. It is transmissible through sex or blood transfusions or needle sharing, etc. It has claimed over 40 million lives in the last 45 years. Around 40 million people live with HIV, most of them living in Africa. There is still no cure, but preventions, early diagnosis, and developed treatments have made AIDS much more manageable. In fact, most people with HIV can and do live full, long, even healthy lives. Dr. Anthony Fauci is one of so many scientists who transformed this runaway killer epidemic into something that we can prevent and manage. Here's Fauci from 12 years ago speaking about AIDS on the HIV.gov website.
Vaccine is going to be part of a combination prevention approach. We already have within our grasp the tools, if fully implemented, to really turn around the AIDS pandemic. We have very effective prevention modalities, from behavior modification to condoms, needle exchange, mother-to-child transmission, circumcision, topical microbicides, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and the most recent dramatic, game-changing observation that was made very recently from an NIH study that was a multinational study, but sponsored by my institute, was what's called HPTN-052, which was the trial that showed that the earlier you treat an infected person compared to waiting a little bit till their disease progress, not only do we have what we already know is a beneficial effect on the infected person, but a dramatic, truly dramatic decrease in the likelihood that that person will transmit the virus to their sexual partner. And that is a game-changing study which proves that treatment itself can serve as a form of prevention.
Fauci's public health work would go on to address things like the swine flu and Ebola outbreaks. And then, of course, we saw COVID-19. When I come back, we shall do the COVID chapter of the Fauci story. Our profile continues next. I'm just taking a little bit of time on this podcast to talk about Dr. Anthony Fauci, the man who has become the villain of so many stories unjustly. And some people will say, well, Seth Andrews is just biased in favor of Fauci, so he's going to do a favorable profile. But I don't think it's quite that simple. I think we can take a more objective look at his life and see a public servant who doesn't deserve the hate and the awfulness and the cruelty and those who want to discredit and even jail him. It's just crazy to assert as such. As we have discussed his public service work in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, now we want to talk about COVID-19. The first cases of COVID detected between October and November of 2019. Dr. Fauci brought onto the White House Coronavirus Task Force in January 2020 under Donald Trump. He became the face and the voice at the podium, updating all the rest of us. And there we had more controversy. January 21st, January 26th, and February 17th, it was Fauci who said publicly COVID-19 was not a major threat to the American public, or it was a low threat. But the situation was evolving. People needed to take it seriously. Of course, his critics latched on to that low threat claim, and they have run with it. The idea is that this flaky doctor couldn't make up his mind, didn't know what he was talking about, or outright lied. He switched. He flipped. He's unreliable, possibly part of a COVID conspiracy, and that gets us into all kinds of other stuff like the Wuhan lab leak conspiracy theory, for which there is no evidence. There's just no evidence for it. By March of 2020, Fauci predicted that COVID would infect at a rate of 10 times the seasonal flu. And then he said something that his critics would latch onto again. In March, he said everyone should not walk around in masks. He was worried about a mask shortage. Fauci elaborated in an NBC interview 3 years ago. Here's what he said.
Now, early on, when we were in a situation in which there was a real concern about the lack of personal protective equipment on the part of the health providers who needed it, who put themselves in harm's way every day to take care of people who were ill with this virus, that we were thinking we would run out of masks and other things for them. So the recommendation was not to wear a mask because of the shortage of it. Two things happened. One, it became clear that we had enough of the equipment, so there was no shortage. It became clear that cloth coverings that you didn't have to buy in a store, that you could make yourself, were adequate. And thirdly, and probably the most compelling thing, is when it became very clear that anywhere from 20 to 45% of people who were infected didn't have any symptoms. So the risk of your being in contact with someone who said, well, you look good, I look good, we're not infected, was not the case, that you could be spreading it asymptomatically. You put all of those things together, which had us evolve from saying maybe we should hold off on masks because we needed them for the healthcare workers, to saying now everybody should be wearing a mask when they're outside and should be trying to distance. That's one example of evolving as you get more data and you get more information.
As the masks became more available, and Fauci then made his strong recommendations for mask wearing for all of us, the Fox News crowd has been far too eager to soundbite Fauci in unfair ways. It was Fauci who advocated government-mandated shutdowns of many public spaces. And if you thought he was the bad guy before, this is when he really started to receive the hate. He became an enemy of liberty, government overreach, conspiracy, an attack on American freedoms. Now, conversations about those who lost their businesses and their livelihoods with those shutdowns, I think those are legitimate conversations. Many people have never recovered personally or financially, and I think that's fair to say. But a highly contagious COVID-19 virus was catching like wildfire. People were dying. Some could argue that if we had all abided by restrictions and masks and distancing and good sense for just a hot moment in this culture, the pandemic, it would have died away in a matter of just a few weeks. If only we had been able to all cooperate with our preventions. But I will leave those discussions for you to continue in the comment section. By July of 2020, this is just a few months after he was on the task force, Trump already turning on Fauci. By the fall of 2020, conservatives were pushing back on all of it. Distancing, masks, vaccines. Of course, Donald Trump, I think he wore a mask maybe once or twice. Remember, it had the presidential seal on it. But after that, no masks, no distancing, denial about the dangers of COVID. And then Trump got COVID. Fauci goes on 60 Minutes and commits the crime of saying, "Told you so." Here's a clip from Inside Edition about the Fauci-Trump blow-up. This was October of 2020, the month before the presidential election.
The war of words between President Trump and Dr. Anthony Fauci is heating up. Last night, Dr. Fauci was on 60 Minutes saying he wasn't surprised that Mr. Trump had contracted the virus. Today, on a call with campaign staff and some members of the press, the president let loose on the nation's leading infectious disease expert.
President Trump is trashing Dr. Anthony Fauci today, calling him an idiot in a call to his campaign staff that reporters were allowed to listen in on.
People are tired of hearing Fauci and all these idiots. Every time he goes on television, there's always a bomb, but there's a bigger bomb if you fire him.
Trump's fury came after Fauci's 60 Minutes appearance, in which he criticized last month's White House Amy Coney Barrett event.
Were you surprised that President Trump got sick?
Absolutely not. When I saw that on TV, I said, oh my goodness, nothing good can come out of that. That's got to be a problem. And then sure enough, it turned out to be a super spreader event.
Fauci also revealed that he's protected round the clock by federal agents because he and his family are getting death threats.
Hard to believe, isn't it? People don't just disagree or criticize, express concerns in an adult way. We're talking about a whole culture of people protesting with their signs and posters and placards, proclaiming that Fauci is a criminal. Arrest Fauci. Hang Fauci. Those hashtags have been flying around the internet. He is, in the minds of so many, public enemy number one. And again, we see a culture of cruelty which defines itself by its enemies. And how many of those enemies are really good people committed to public health and safety and humanity? How did they get to be the bad guys in the MAGA story? It's so frustrating. And then we come to the very recent House Select Committee on the Coronavirus, where Fauci makes his appearance and gets the joy of being interrogated. Actually, it wasn't an interrogation. It was just a monologue. It was a ranting, frothing series of outrageous accusations by Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. As much as I hate to listen to the sound of her voice, check out just a little bit of what she said.
But let's also talk a little bit further about the type of science that you represent. NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers, a fact that's been hidden. Let's talk about the fact about, is it right for scientists and doctors getting paid by the American people, government taxpayer paychecks, to get patents where they're paid millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in royalty fees, especially when the NIH and these government agencies, most powerful agencies in our country, are recommending medical suggestions and advice and making up guidelines like 6 feet distancing and masking of children. Do you think that's appropriate? Do the American people deserve to be abused like that, Mr. Fauci? Because you're not doctor, you're Mr. Fauci in my few minutes. No, I don't need your answer. I want to talk about this right here.
Mr. Chairman,
Fauci,
objection.
I reclaim my time.
Objection.
I reclaim my time. Mr. Raskin.
Gentlelady will suspend.
Mr. Chairman,
Point of order.
Just in terms of the rules of decorum, are we allowed to deny that a doctor is a doctor just because we don't want him to be a doctor?
Yes, because in my time, that man does not deserve to have a license. As a matter of fact, it should be revoked, and he belongs in
Gentlelady will
prison.
suspend.
Of course, you heard there the voice of reason, how refreshing it is to have Congressman Jamie Raskin out of Maryland in the room. But Marjorie Taylor Greene was not finished. I'm going to subject you to one more soundbite. This is her in the hallway after the hearing.
He's guilty of mass murder. I mean, Fauci he's an absolute monster. He should have his medical license revoked, and he should be charged and tried for crimes against humanity.
Now, this is the same woman who went on another rant back in February against another physician, as there was a Senate subcommittee hearing on Capitol Hill about COVID with Dr. Peter Marks, the director of Biologics Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. He was talking about how the COVID vaccine had saved millions of lives. Marjorie Taylor Greene goes, no, it wasn't. And of course, we have to listen to Greene because she's credible. After all, she was once a former CrossFit gym owner, and he is just the director of Biologics Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration and a board-certified hematologist and oncologist. Anyway, Marjorie Taylor Greene was saying the vaccine caused everything from strokes to heart attacks to miscarriages to turbo cancers, which is a nothing term. It was actually used way back in the day in an experiment, a random experiment with mice to study inflammation in the body. It has nothing to do with anything, certainly cancer. But of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene's talking about turbo cancer. You hear this woman and you just shake your head and you say, how is this even happening? I mean, it's not just the tenor of her voice. Does anybody else feel that? You hear that sound and you just want to drive into a retaining wall. Just end it. And it's not just the tenor of her voice, and I'm a voice person, right? Just listening to the sound. It's the condescension and the cruelty and the supposed credibility coming from a person who is as smart as fish bait. She doesn't even have one oar in the water. The woman is several tacos short of a combo. If she was any dumber, you would have to water her 3 times a week. Now, nobody's saying that the scientists and scientific organizations and the process has been perfect, nor am I saying that there have not been bad agents and people who have done stupid stuff. And one of the protests from many in the anti-Fauci crowd has to do with this leaked email from the National Institute of Health. An advisor to the NIH, a guy named David Morans, apparently was trying to evade public records requests by using his personal email for NIH business. And he is listed as an advisor, a top advisor to Dr. Anthony Fauci. They work in separate buildings. Fauci says that he does not operate in a critical capacity when it comes to making public health policy. He referenced this on CNN as he spoke with Caitlin Collins.
The other thing that came up today was focused on the U.S. and how a deputy of yours at the NIH bragged about evading federal records laws and deleting emails to where they couldn't be produced to reporters and members of the public who were requesting them. And you talked about this, but what changes do you believe the NIH should make to ensure that these open records requests, which we believe are fundamentally important, are not purposefully obstructed by officials?
Well, first of all, Caitlin, let me say that the individual who did that was wrong. That is unexcusable and inappropriate. And that is not the way things go at the NIH. That is an outlier and not typical at all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of very hardworking, committed people at the National Institutes of Health. So I hope that the public and the audience doesn't realize or doesn't come to the conclusion, if I might say, that one single person who did something that is totally unacceptable and very inappropriate, that is reflective of the thousands of people who are doing their job and are committed to the health of this country.
Now, it's interesting to see our reaction to a statement like that. And I think it's almost a social experiment. What do you think about COVID and COVID preventions and the vaccines and science and Fauci in general, and how will those perceptions, positions, opinions, biases affect whether or not we believe him? Of course, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world are going to say it's all a massive cover-up and he's a piece of shit and the NIH is just a big, star chamber of conspiracists who are trying to kill people with turbo cancer. And people like me, I'll admit it, I'm like, this guy's a 50-year public servant, a credible scientist, sure, a flawed human being, but do I think he's part of a cabal of COVID conspiracists trying to kill people or cover everything up? Do I think he's not working in the public interest? I don't buy that. I just don't buy it. I think he's a good man, and he sure deserves a whole lot better than to be threatened with death. People are saying, we're going to kill you, not just you. We're going to kill your wife. We're going to kill your children. And for that reason, he can't go anywhere without security. He was asked about this at the hearing and became very emotional speaking about his family. After that, on the same day, he had a conversation about the death threats with CNN's Caitlin Collins.
I have testified literally hundreds of times over the last 40 years over Congress, and there's always been differences of opinion, differences of ideology, criticisms, and things like that. But the level of vitriol that we see now, just in the country in general, but actually played out during this hearing, was really quite unfortunate, because the purpose of hearings are to try and figure out how we can do better so that next time, if and when we are faced with a pandemic, we'd be better prepared and we could benefit. If mistakes were made, we identify them and we try to correct them for the future. That's not what we saw today, as shown by the clip you showed with Marjorie Taylor Greene. That was nothing about trying to do better, unfortunately.
And, you testified there at the end about the threats that you and your family are still getting, even to this day. And for those who don't know, that was your wife, Christine, who is esteemed in her own right, sitting behind you there. And I just wonder if you ever thought that you would still be getting threats like that, credible threats against your life, even now, 2 years out of government service.
It's very interesting. It's a pattern, Caitlin, that whenever somebody gets up, whether it's a news media, Fox News does it a lot, or it's somebody in the Congress who gets up and makes a public statement that I'm responsible for the deaths of X number of people because of policies or some crazy idea that I created the virus, immediately it's like clockwork, the death threats go way up. So that's the reason why I'm still getting death threats. When you have performances like that unusual performance by Marjorie Taylor Greene in today's hearing, those are the kind of things that drive up the death threats, because there are a segment of the population out there that believe that kind of nonsense.
For the last segment of this broadcast, I want to go beyond the scientists. And I'm not just talking about Dr. Fauci or frontline virologists like Dr. Peter Hotez, who has also been threatened with death. I'm going to talk about the culture that is fueling all of this vitriol. There was an article published by the Association of American Medical Colleges. The article titled, "Why Do So Many Americans Distrust Science?" I'm going to read it for you next. On May the 4th, 2022, the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, published an article about this crazy culture that we seem to live in, where people are declaring war on science and scientists. And I wanted to read it for you for the last segment of the broadcast. It's titled, "Why Do So Many Americans Distrust Science?" written by senior staff writer Patrick Boyle. The reading of this article takes about 20 minutes. Medical science is creating miracles and losing trust. It's emerging from the darkest days of the pandemic with both life-saving discoveries and a crisis in credibility. Although confusion and hostility are defining features of the past 2 years of COVID-19, the crisis of trust in our society didn't start with COVID-19 and won't end with COVID-19. It's not about a disease. It's not about Twitter. It's not about facts alone. Stephen Joffe, interim chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, warns it's not just a COVID thing. Rather, the pandemic provided a fertile environment for myriad social and technological forces to breed confusion and distrust. Those forces ignite epidemics of misinformation against pillars of society, among them our systems of justice, education, science, and democracy. Timothy Caulfield, research director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta, Canada, says trust in scientific institutions has taken a huge hit. Janet Woodcock, MD and Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, says the whole strength of science is that people who have different ideological bents can do experiments, transcend their prior beliefs, and try to build a foundation of facts. Now we have whole groups of people who don't believe that. Moving forward, scientists working on high-visibility health projects are more likely than ever to find themselves operating within an infodemic, an overload of information about a problem, much of it wrong, that makes it harder to solve the problem. Science leaders in government and academia say that meeting the challenge to regain credibility requires a deeper understanding of several conditions. The forces and factors behind distrust, which include a public overwhelmed by too much information, growing polarization, disinformation campaigns by domestic or foreign corporations and governments, a media environment that rewards outrage and outlandishness, and the increasingly public nature of scientific research. The people who spread and who absorb misinformation, who include those who set out to find the truth but get confused or outraged by misinformation they stumble into, conspiracy theorists who gravitate toward stories that confirm their suspicions, and organized groups that peddle disinformation for profit. The motives behind disinformation, which is a form of misinformation that is deliberately deceptive. Those motives include politics, arousing opposition to the other side, profit, making money by pushing bogus scientific products, social advocacy, raising support for a cause that cuts against the scientific consensus, and even foreign affairs, sowing distrust in an adversary's government. For example, reports by the European Parliament and the Center for European Policy Analysis concluded that Russia and China spread disinformation about COVID-19's origins and COVID-19 vaccines in order to convince people in democracies that they cannot trust their health systems and to exacerbate tensions in Western governments. Timothy Caulfield says disinformation strategists are, quote, weaponizing scientific uncertainty and trying to create distrust. They're trying to create information chaos. When it comes to measuring the impact of the attacks on medical science, opinion polls have, ironically, produced results that confirm what anyone wants to believe. Some polls show that science and medicine, defined broadly, retain high overall trust in the United States, right up there with the military. Where people turn skeptical is when scientists draw conclusions about issues that pluck sensitive chords, namely telling people what to do. The Pew Research Center reported in February of 2022 that 29% of U.S. adults say they have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public, down from 40% in November 2020 and below the ratings before the coronavirus emerged. One troubling consistency demonstrated in a poll by Gallup is that Republicans have been losing trust in medical science for years, while trust among Democrats holds steady. The more people see science as another politicized field, as many people see the movie industry and mainstream news, the more they will dismiss scientific findings that clash with their worldviews. Sudip Parikh, Ph.D. and CEO for the American Association of the Advancement of Science, says we now have a significant minority of the population that's hostile to scientific expertise. We are going to have to work hard to regain trust. Lack of trust in health authorities can hurt people. The U.S. Surgeon General and the World Health Organization have declared that health misinformation is a threat to public health because it leads people to ignore science-based recommendations about behaviors to practice and to avoid. At the FDA, Woodcock sees risks even to basic communications about food and drug safety. She states, "If we say this food additive is safe, there are going to be people who just say we don't have any credibility. There will be people who say they're lying." On a global scale, scientists fear that the spread of misinformation will make it impossible to successfully meet other public health challenges, pollution, climate change, and future epidemics, among others. The forces and factors that drive distrust: people are overwhelmed by information coming through their computers, phones, and televisions. Sometimes they can't sort out all the breaking information about critical health issues. Even Lindsay Leininger feels it. She's a public health scientist and co-founder of Dear Pandemic, an online forum created to help people navigate the COVID-19 information overwhelm. She's also a mother trying to protect her children. Quote, "There is all this decision fatigue for parents. Should my kids wear masks to school even if they're not required? Should I get them vaccinated?" Complicating the task is that some of the misinformation is designed to confuse and divide people. Journalist Jonathan Rausch says one way to do that is to flood the zone with falsehoods and conspiracy theories and to cause mass disorientation. Uncertain on how to tell what's true and false, Leininger observes people rely on proxies to guide them. You say, "This is not my expertise. I'm going to rely on somebody whose expertise this is. Who are the people I trust? What do they say?" Leininger turns to peers in science. Those not in science turn to trusted TV personalities, bloggers, friends, and community leaders who might share their political and social values and assess the information through those lenses. The country is growing more socially divided and politically polarized. As a result, people increasingly get much of their information about the world, politics, science, foreign affairs, and more from people and institutions that confirm their beliefs and ignore sources that run contrary to those beliefs. This harms health efforts. The Surgeon General's advisory says misinformation tends to flourish in environments of significant societal division, animosity, and distrust. The divisions and distrust make people more open, even eager to accept information that discredits the beliefs of people on the other side. Diane Ben-Scoter, founder of a group focused on psychological manipulation, says they like feeling part of this community. When you give them facts that say it's big medicine, big pharma, big corporations feeding you lies, they want to believe it's lies. Climate change illustrates the struggle to win over skeptics in a polarized society. Many liberal leaders have zealously taken up the cause of combating climate change as a core issue. Conservative commentators have responded with fury and stoked fear in their audiences. The clash has spiraled to the point where the science doesn't matter as much as the politics, as each side feels that agreeing with the other would constitute abandoning their tribe. Vera Donnenberg, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Cardiothoracic Surgery at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, says perhaps the most serious threat to science is the politicization of scientific facts. Once a scientific issue becomes politicized, it gains its own life. Trust in institutions is eroding. All government and private institutions that develop health policies suffer harm from news reports about research scandals such as fraud, conflicting findings among scientific studies, and dismissive pronouncements that everyone should just trust the science. As Jonathan Haidt, Ph.D., a social psychologist at New York University, says, when people lose trust in institutions, they lose trust in the stories told by those institutions. In Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, philosophy professor Dr. Maya Goldenberg contends that some people oppose vaccines in general, not because they don't know enough about science, but because they don't trust the institutions that recommend vaccines. When it comes to COVID-19, some researchers found that in countries where citizens reported a high level of trust in their government institutions overall, people were more likely to follow mitigation efforts such as masking and getting vaccinated. At the same time, however, the ever-changing scientific knowledge about the disease triggered confusing and sometimes contradictory messaging from authorities, which reduced trust. Adding to the erosion is increased access to scientific research, which allows people to find science that supports what they want to believe. When everyone can become their own expert, it's easy to wave off declarations from science institutions as flawed or driven by hidden agendas. Perhaps the most common tactic of disinformation campaigns is making people doubt that scientists have reached a consensus on an issue. All it takes is providing a few people of questionable expertise to disagree with all those credible experts. Dr. Sander van der Linden, who is a social psychology professor at the University of Cambridge in the UK, says, we can say thousands of scientists agree, but they say, here are all these important people who disagree. As soon as we introduce a contrarian perspective, people lose all sense of the weight of the evidence that supports the consensus. For years, tobacco companies paid for research that sowed doubt about the overwhelming consensus by independent scientists that cigarettes cause cancer. Van der Linden has researched the practice of climate change deniers to stir doubts about the consensus on that issue. They create reports that say some scientists disagree. Many times, the denier scientists have no expertise in climate science, but lay people don't know that. The art of science gets turned against science. The power of science lies in continuously challenging what scientists think they know. We have hypotheses, we test them, And when the data show that those hypotheses aren't right, we change them. To the public, all that adjusting and contradicting of findings raises suspicions of incompetence or worse. In our polarized world, changing your mind about something based on data is evidence of cover-up, conflict, or corruption. Not long ago, this iterative process ran largely out of the public eye. Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics at the Perelman School of Medicine, Dr. Holly Lynch, says for a long time it was scientists talking with each other and debating these things at conferences and in scientific journals. Now the public witnesses many of these discussions thanks to pre-publication access to scientific research before it is fully vetted. The fast spread of research findings, including contradictions of previous findings through the internet and social media, and online discussions dissecting or even ripping apart research. Science is becoming more and more accessible, which is a good thing in one regard, but that has put on public display this process of debate and iterative approaches to figuring out what is true. This has been a game changer. Groups profit from disinformation. Sure, some disinformation comes from conspiracy-obsessed tweeters with too much free time, but those people get lots of material from well-funded groups with practical objectives: make money, win elections, or advance causes. There are actors in this plot who have motives other than being angry. There are people who are interjecting themselves into this dialogue in order to accomplish other objectives. Companies have attacked government advice about COVID-19 protections and treatments in order to sell alternative, unproven products. For example, some providers continued selling the anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine as protection against COVID-19, even after a study touting its benefits against the disease was retracted. In other cases, companies use misinformation strategies to protect their profits. Jaffe at the Perelman School of Medicine points to oil companies that produced studies casting doubt about the impact of their product on climate change. There has been a concerted effort from some quarters to undermine trust in science for private purposes. Sometimes those purposes include advancing social agendas. A report by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, based in the UK, found that 12 anti-vaxxers are responsible for almost 2/3 of anti-vaccine content circulating on social media platforms. Amid the COVID-19 vaccination backlash, anti-vaccine organizations enjoyed an increase in contributions. This all means that doctors, health professionals, and researchers need to better understand the nature of the credibility challenge so they can craft effective countermeasures. Those measures range from physicians strategically responding to disinformation on social media to institutions working with trusted community leaders to educate the public, to government agencies thwarting information warfare. Because as Jacqueline Mason, director of programs at the nonprofit Media Democracy Fund, told the Conference on Disinformation and the Erosion of Democracy about disinformation campaigns, quote, "This isn't just for fun." And that is the end of the article. At the end of the day, I guess I have an agenda. I wanted to come to the defense of Dr. Anthony Fauci and scientists like him doing important work and deserving so much more than the venom and vitriol and vilification that they have received out there. Nobody said they're perfect. We are all human beings, but they are definitely the good guys in our story, and they deserve allies like you and me. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you back here next time.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.